In the quiet hours of an ordinary day, when life feels predictable and routine, one single moment shattered everything. This is the story of a woman whose kindness touched everyone she met, and the man who let obsession twist his mind into something unrecognizable. What unfolded behind a closed apartment door left an entire community terrified, investigators stunned, and a family destroyed forever. There are cases that slip quietly through the cracks of everyday life, hidden beneath routines, workplaces, and familiar faces. And then there are cases like this, where a single event exposes a truth so unsettling that it leaves an entire community shaken for years. When 26-year-old Carolyn Binkton left her office for what should have been an ordinary lunch break on Juneteenth, 2019, no one imagined she was walking toward the final moments of her life. What followed became one of the most intricate and haunting investigations in Plainsboro, New Jersey. To understand how everything spiraled so quickly, we have to start with who Carolyn was long before the tragedy. Born on May 30th, 1993, she grew up surrounded by family values that shaped her into someone deeply compassionate and ambitious. Her academic success spoke volumes: 3 bachelor's degrees in international affairs, sociology, and anthropology from Lafayette College. Not many people accomplished that in such a short time, and it highlighted her dedication to understanding the world around her. Carolyn even spent time studying abroad in Japan and Germany, experiences that gave her a broader outlook and a maturity far beyond her age. After graduating in 2015, she joined a marketing firm near her hometown. Co-workers described her as reliable, calm, and incredibly focused. She volunteered often, never missed deadlines, and carried herself with a gentle confidence. She wasn't the kind of person who got involved in conflicts or drama, and that's why the events of Juneteenth felt so deeply out of place. When someone with a spotless record suddenly vanishes in the middle of the workday, colleagues begin to worry immediately. That day started like any other. Carolyn left the office around noon, most likely planning to grab lunch or return home briefly. People noticed she didn't come back to her desk, but at first no one thought much of it. However, as the hours passed, and as messages and calls went unanswered, concern turned into alarm. This wasn't Carolyn. She didn't leave early. She didn't disappear unexpectedly, and she certainly didn't ignore people who depended on her at work. Her coworkers eventually contacted law enforcement. Officers arrived at her apartment to conduct a welfare check. What they found inside confirmed everyone's worst fears. The door was unlocked, and the scene inside made it clear that something catastrophic had happened. The investigation didn't take long to shift from a missing person case to a full-scale homicide inquiry. Neighbors later reported hearing screams around midday. One neighbor mentioned what sounded like furniture scraping across the floor shortly after those cries, noises that, in hindsight, aligned eerily with the time frame of Carolyn's disappearance. But the most confusing part for detectives wasn't the violence itself. It was the quiet attempt someone had made to remove evidence. Someone had tried to clean parts of the apartment using bleach. It wasn't thorough, but the intent was obvious. This was not the work of a stranger rushing out in panic. Someone familiar with Carolyn lingered long enough to try hiding what had happened. Investigators quickly determined there was no sign of robbery or forced entry. Nothing was taken, and the objects used in the assault had come directly from Carolyn's own home. That single detail changed the entire direction of the investigation. A random attacker doesn't use household items. A stranger doesn't walk in without breaking a lock. Everything suggested a personal motive, one fueled by intense emotion rather than opportunity. But Carolyn had no known enemies, no recent arguments, no breakups, no dramatic conflicts. The people in her life described her as someone who rarely clashed with anyone. So how does a young woman with no known threats suddenly become the focal point of such a tragic incident? Detectives began interviewing her colleagues, focusing first on who saw her last. That's when a name came up repeatedly: Kenneth Saul, a 30-year-old accountant who worked in the same office. Kenneth was married, a father, and generally viewed as a quiet person who kept to himself, but something immediately stood out. He had left the office around the same time as Carolyn, and his behavior afterward didn't match the seriousness of the situation. Kenneth returned to work later than expected. When asked why he was absent, he claimed he was having car trouble and had gone to a repair shop. This seemed straightforward until his manager called the shop out of curiosity. They had no record of Kenneth being there that day. That inconsistency alone was concerning, but it wasn't the only thing raising suspicion. Coworkers also noticed scratches on Kenneth's hand. His explanation didn't match the injuries, and the timing aligned disturbingly well with Carolyn's death. Even more suspicious was a question he asked someone in the office later that week: whether a person could be arrested solely on circumstantial evidence. For detectives, that was a remarkable thing to bring up during a murder investigation involving someone he worked with. When questioned, Kenneth altered his story. Now he claimed he had fixed the car himself at a nearby park instead of going to a repair shop. But Kenneth was an accountant, not a mechanic. The revised explanation did nothing to ease doubts. If anything, it made investigators more convinced that his day didn't go the way he said it did. Then came a crucial discovery. Dash cam footage from a passing vehicle placed Kenneth's car near Carolyn's apartment complex during the exact window of her disappearance. This contradicted his claim about being near the office. Now detectives had physical movement tying him to the location. Unexplained scratches, inconsistent stories, and suspicious behavior at work. Still, there was one major hurdle. No definitive DNA connected him to the scene. Skin found under Carolyn's fingernails suggested she fought back, but the test results were inconclusive. They didn't confirm the attacker's identity, but they also didn't eliminate Kenneth. This placed investigators in a difficult spot. Without a clear forensic match, they needed a stronger narrative built through evidence, interviews, and timeline reconstruction. Even with these complications, the circumstantial case against Kenneth was growing stronger by the day. Detectives continued gathering details, analyzing every movement, every inconsistency, and every interaction Kenneth had with Carolyn. But what no one knew yet was that this was only the beginning. The truth behind Kenneth's connection to Carolyn and the extent of what he was willing to do to escape suspicion would soon reveal a story far darker than anyone could have imagined.
The investigation into Carolyn Bennington's death had already taken several unexpected turns, but detectives were still far from understanding the full truth. While the circumstantial evidence against Kenneth Saul continued to grow, investigators needed something stronger, something that didn't just hint at involvement, but directly exposed his intentions and actions. What happened next would do exactly that, revealing a side of Kenneth that no one, not even his family, could have imagined. After detectives confronted Kenneth about the inconsistencies in his timeline, they expected him to adjust small details or perhaps deny involvement altogether. What they did not expect was a dramatic escalation that would reshape the case entirely. While sitting in jail awaiting trial, Kenneth made a decision that investigators later described as one of the most shocking and reckless attempts to mislead an investigation they had ever seen. It began when he wrote a letter to a fellow inmate, someone he believed was desperate enough to carry out a violent task for money. In that letter, Kenneth offered $15,000 to murder a random woman between the ages of 25 and 30. But this wasn't just any proposed attack. Kenneth gave detailed instructions that made investigators' stomachs drop. The attacker should use a screwdriver and scissors, target the neck, and clean the scene with bleach. These were private details from Carolyn's case, details never released to the public. Kenneth's plan was chilling in its intent. He wanted to create a second crime so similar to Carolyn's murder that investigators would assume they were dealing with a serial killer. He hoped this would cast doubt on his involvement and redirect the entire investigation toward an unknown suspect. But Kenneth didn't stop there. He described in writing how the killer should move, what to say, and how to avoid being caught. Even worse, he also suggested targeting the lead detective on his case or killing a witness previously interviewed by police. The plan was to stage the second person's death as a suicide and plan a confession letter to make it look as though someone else had been responsible for Carolyn's murder. In Kenneth's mind, this would clear his name completely. However, the inmate he spoke to wasn't the accomplice he thought he had found. Instead, the inmate quietly informed investigators, who immediately recognized the severity of what Kenneth was attempting. They turned the man into a confidential informant, fitted him with a wire, and collected recordings of Kenneth discussing the murder-for-hire scheme in detail. These conversations weren't vague or speculative. Kenneth spoke about the methods, timing, and even how to escape unnoticed afterwards. He provided instructions written in his own hand, notes that investigators would later find in his jail cell. These documents included details about Carolyn's murder, intended to be placed near the second victim. It was clear Kenneth had constructed an elaborate plan based on the belief that one more crime could erase the first. This single discovery transformed the case. Even without a conclusive DNA match, the combination of suspicious timelines, shifting stories, and now a murder-for-hire plot painted a damning picture. Prosecutors understood that a jury would find this behavior compelling. Still, they worried about one thing: the lack of physical evidence placing Kenneth unmistakably inside Carolyn's apartment at the moment of the crime. So they kept building a timeline, tying every movement to a pattern of obsession. That's when Kenneth made another unexpected move, one that changed everything. Almost 3 years after the murder, in November 2022, he accepted a plea deal, agreeing to confess in exchange for avoiding the risk of a trial that could result in an even longer sentence. During his confession, Kenneth finally revealed the disturbing truth behind the crime. He admitted he had developed strong romantic feelings for Carolyn starting in 2016. While Carolyn remained polite and professional, she never showed interest in anything beyond a work relationship. Kenneth misinterpreted her kindness as something deeper. Over time, this misunderstanding grew into fixation. He began watching her closely, checking her schedule, noticing when she left for breaks. Then his behavior crossed a boundary that no one around him realized at the time. Kenneth secretly copied Carolyn's apartment key. He explained he had been entering her home during lunch breaks when she wasn't there. Sometimes he would just walk through the rooms. Sometimes he would sit in silence. Eventually, he installed hidden cameras inside her living space, all without her knowledge. This was the point where the investigation turned from a mystery into something far more disturbing. Kenneth had been spying on Carolyn for months, building a fantasy that grew out of control. He confessed that on June 10, 2019, he entered her apartment as usual, believing she would be at work. But Carolyn unexpectedly came home early. The moment she realized someone was inside her apartment, her shock must have been overwhelming. Kenneth described hiding, panicking, and then confronting her when she saw him. What followed, according to his statement, was a desperate attempt to silence her fear and keep her from calling for help. He admitted to attacking her in that moment of panic and obsession. Afterwards, he tried to clean the scene with bleach, grabbed the hidden cameras, and returned to work as if nothing had happened. When prosecutors read his confession aloud in court, Carolyn's family sat silently. Their pain couldn't be measured, but they finally had answers to the questions that had haunted them for years. Kenneth was sentenced in January 2023 for the murder, plus an additional 10 years for conspiracy to commit murder due to his jailhouse plot. The total, 55 years, means he will likely spend the rest of his life in prison. Kenneth addressed the court, apologizing to both families and expressing remorse. But many questioned the sincerity of his words, given the lengths he went to in order to escape justice. In late 2024, Kenneth filed an appeal, claiming his rights were violated during the investigation. The appeal was dismissed, with courts ruling that the evidence, recordings, and investigative actions were all legally obtained. The case finally reached its conclusion. What remained was the memory of a young woman whose life was built on kindness, ambition, and a promising future, all taken away by someone she barely knew outside of the professional world.
If you're still here watching, thank you. Before you go, please subscribe to our channel, Dark Frame Stories, and turn on the notification bell so you never miss another real-life mystery like this.